Hello, everybody. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the next installment in our Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series, which is being co-sponsored today by the University of California, Berkeley. Our speaker is Ethan Katz. He received his BA from Amherst and his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin. Before moving to Berkeley, he taught at the University of Cincinnati, and he is now Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Berkeley, where he co-leads an anti-Semitism education initiative, which he recently founded. A specialist of France and the Francophone world, Katz's research interests include Jewish-Muslim relations, Jews in colonial societies, Holocaust studies, and the interplay between the religious and secular in modern Jewish life. His first book, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, published by Harvard in 2015, received a number of prizes, including a National Jewish Book Award and the J. Russell Major Prize of the American Historical Association. Katz has also co-edited 3 books. These include Colonialism and the Jews, honored last year as a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award, and most recently a special issue of the journal Jewish History on Jews and Muslims in France before and after Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher. He's now at work on an exciting new book project on the Jewish underground in Algiers during World War II, currently entitled Freeing the Empire, the Uprising of Jews and Anti-Semites that Helped Win World War II. And his lecture today draws from research for this project. So I want to urge all of you to ask questions, to write your questions at any point. You can start writing as soon as he starts talking, but submit those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't raise your hand. I won't see it, and don't virtually raise your hand because I won't see that either. And the chat function has been disabled. So the way it's going to work is that Ethan is going to give his presentation for about 30-35 minutes. And then we will open it up to your questions that I will filter from the Q&A function. So Ethan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Maury. Thank you for the invitation and for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Ines Selaskova for all of the arrangements that were made in setting up and publicizing the lecture, and Etta Heber at Berkeley for her work as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. One moment. Okay. In the early morning hours of November 8th, 1942, the American and British armies began Operation Torch. At that time, the largest amphibious landing in recorded human history, the invasion saw 110,000 troops and 800 warships and transports land on a score of beaches spanning more than 1,200 miles of the Atlantic and Mediterranean coastlines. The key site for the campaign was North Africa, and all involved in the strategic planning agreed that victory ran through the rapid seizure of the city of Algiers. Now, it's well known that Operation Torch opened a crucial second front in World War II, soon chasing the Axis forces from North Africa, setting in motion the Allied liberation of Southern Europe. What is far less well known is that the Allied path into Algiers was paved by the work of an underground movement in which a band of young Jewish liberals teamed with a group of arch-conservative military brass and businessmen. Over a period of months preceding the invasion, the resistors coordinated their efforts with the Americans, in particular with Robert Murphy, the special U.S. envoy to the region, who reported directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the last days before the invasion, the home of only Aboulker became the headquarters for the insurgency. Aboulker was a prominent figure in the Algerian Jewish community and more broadly respected as a doctor, professor, and local political leader. His son, who's pictured here on the left, the 22-year-old medical student José Aboulker, had been one of the earliest to organize resistance in Algeria and would assume central importance in the insurrection. In the wee hours of November 8th, the designated date of the Allied landing, a rather motley group of several hundred students, shop owners, doctors, lawyers, and a handful of French military officers managed to take over nearly all of Vichy France's major institutions in Algiers and to place the regime's key leaders under house arrest. The success of the underground was all the more remarkable for the numerous obstacles it faced. The insurgents were ill-equipped, only possessing several hundred Lebel rifles that predated World War I and tour buses provided by the Americans. In many cases, their claim to authority was thin. They had disguised themselves by wearing armbands with the initials VP, the insignia of a local volunteer militia tied to the Vichy regime. In the days before the invasion, promised arms from the Americans repeatedly failed to appear. At the appointed time on the night of November 8th, at least 1/3 of the young men who had affiliated with the insurgency movement did not show up. In the midst of chaos, José Abouker took charge as various teams of insurgents fanned out to key points throughout the city. At a series of locations, the same scene repeated itself. A small group of resistors showed up wearing the armbands of the local militia, carrying rifles that in some cases they did not know how to use, and showing orders for them to relieve the Vichy commanders. Unsuspecting, the officers on duty turned over control of each strategic location to the members of the insurgency. Yet as dawn broke, there was still no sign of the Americans. They had elected to take a slow and circuitous path toward Algiers rather than the rapid one originally promised. Now Vichy had begun to fight back. José Abouker utilized a blend of ruse and inspiration to rally the resistors, imploring them over the radio to hold their posts for as long as possible. Eventually, late that day, the Allies entered Algiers and took control of the city without firing a shot. Before too long, they would control the broader Mediterranean. At the time of the invasion, North Africa was under the control of the Vichy government, France's authoritarian pro-German regime that had taken power shortly after the French surrender to the Germans in June 1940. In October 1940, of its own accord, Vichy had abrogated the Crémieux Decree, the act that in 1870 had made nearly all Algerian Jews into equal French citizens. The decree had been a turning point in Algerian Jewish history, separating Jews from their Muslim fellow natives who did not enjoy citizenship and became racially defined as so-called indigènes, which translated to natives but had a more negative connotation. And this began a process whereby Algeria's Jews would gradually become deeply attached to French language and culture. Now, in October of 1940, with the stroke of a pen, Jews were suddenly demoted to indigènes or colonial subjects themselves. They occupied the same status as Muslims. Further anti-Semitic measures followed. Much to the consternation of the Jewish insurgents of November 8, 1942, the liberation of Algeria by the Allies did not restore Jews' pre-war status overnight. Instead, a new battle began over the territory's French leadership and ideological direction. Jews, despite their central role in the uprising, did not succeed immediately in regaining their rights. For the first few months following the landing, all of the racial laws remained in place, and Jews who had lost their professional position or their property only recovered them on an individual basis. It was only in October of 1943, nearly a year later, that Jews in Algeria regained their French citizenship. Now, scholarship on the Algiers underground and its Jewish participants remains rather limited, and to date it has generally focused on either the military and political strategy of the North African campaign and its aftermath, or on the episode as a case of Jewish heroism soon betrayed by the American invaders and the French administration. These analyses have left us with little sense of who the resistors were and what motivated them. More specifically, we are left to wonder at the curious alliance at the heart of the story. For the group's ideological diversity was remarkable. Monarchists and communists, opponents of democracy and ardent Republicans, and perhaps most strikingly, Jews and anti-Semites joined together in what became known as the movement of November 8th. How was this possible? In the book I'm currently writing, this is among the puzzles I'm trying to piece together. And the focus of much of my talk today will be outlining the participants in this rebel alliance and discussing some of the possible catalysts for their cooperation that not only seems counterintuitive today, but did at the time as well. I should add that this is very much a book in progress, and I look forward to your questions and comments as I continue to think about the issues that I'm discussing today. But before I get to this puzzle, we can only appreciate the history and significance of the Algiers insurrection by placing it within the broader context of the Holocaust in North Africa and European political culture in Algeria. While Central and Eastern Europe, of course, saw the greatest anti-Semitic atrocities during the Holocaust, the nearly 500,000 Jews living in French North Africa suffered significantly as well. Many racial laws enacted by Vichy were extended to Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, leading to severe professional quotas, intensive surveillance, and more than 100 labor camps, where Jewish prisoners were often singled out for especially harsh treatment. Algeria is particularly significant to the European story. The territory was in large part annexed to France since the 19th century and was home to almost 1 million European colonial settlers whose political culture was steeped in the anti-Semitism of the 1930s. By late 1941, most Jewish children had been expelled from the public primary schools in Algeria. Most notable and devastating of the measures taken in Algeria, however, was Vichy's decision in autumn 1940 to strip all Jews of the French citizenship that they had enjoyed for 70 years. The story of the resistance also looks different from the Mediterranean's southern shore. What we mostly know about the French resistance is a classic case in which history has been written by the victors. The wartime triumph and post-war legacy of the Gaullists and communists helped to create a narrative that makes several assumptions. First, we imagine that French insurgents emerged in opposition not only to the Germans, but also to the Vichy government. In addition, we see the resistance as comprised of liberals, Republicans, socialists, and communists. Finally, according to a stubbornly enduring narrative, on one side stood résistants fighting virtuously against Nazi and Vichy anti-Semitism, while on the other side stood anti-Semitic perpetrators and collaborators. The story of the Algiers insurgency problematizes each of these assumptions. The developments that would become the Algiers insurrection gathered steam across 3 geographical nodal points, and the first of these was not Algiers, but somewhat surprisingly, it was actually Vichy, the resort town in the Massif Central region of southern France, where Marshal Philippe Pétain set up the new French government after the fall of France in June 1940. As many of you know, Vichy was authoritarian, anti-republican, traditionalist, pro-German, and anti-Semitic. It was also, as counterintuitive as it seems, an important wellspring of early resistance. While they remain little known, during the early months following the defeat, numerous Vichy officials engaged in a double game. They remained loyal to Marshal Pétain, but they mistakenly believed that he was hamstrung by the occupiers and that they should thus begin to undertake the work of resistance that he ultimately supported but could not do himself and might openly join someday. These were among the group that a handful of historians of the occupation in France have in recent years dubbed Vichysto-résistants. The notion of the Vichysto-résistants only really emerged in the aftermath of revelations in the mid-1990s that then French President François Mitterrand, pictured second from the right in the photo on the left here, had affiliated for several years with the organizations of the far right and had worked loyally for Vichy France until 1943. This was a major, shocking scandal at the time in France. Indeed, the Vichysto-résistants also included many, like Mitterrand, who underwent a process of evolution in the course of the war, from Vichy loyalists to full participants in the organized resistance. The term applies as well to those who had been members of interwar extreme right groups, but decided, while retaining their ideology, to act against not only the Nazis, but also the Vichy regime. Even as they fiercely opposed the Germans and sought to renew the French fight against Nazism, these men and women often supported much of Vichy's social policy, including regarding Jews. And this was the case for several actors in the Algiers insurgency. In order to account for the importance of the arch-conservatives who were the Vichysto-résistants and played a leading role in the insurrection, we have to turn to the second geographic node in our story, Washington. Washington's eyes and ears in North Africa were substantially those of U.S. envoy Robert Murphy, who reported directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. From the moment of the French defeat in June 1940, the race was on to find partners in French North Africa who might play a role in an eventual effort to liberate Europe. Murphy, along with other key American officials, took a decidedly pragmatic approach in looking for these partners. Murphy and his colleagues long believed that some version of Vichy, in fact, might be part of the solution rather than the problem. Eventually, the Americans became convinced that General Henri Giraud, rather than Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France in London, was the right man to lead the resistance. Giraud was at heart a proud French patriot who believed the Germans could be defeated. What he sought to overturn was not Vichy's social policies, but rather its decision to collaborate with the Germans. Giraud himself was unabashedly anti-Semitic. The choice of Giraud as leader of the resistance highlights what would become a key pattern of American conduct in North Africa: a single-minded focus on winning the war at the expense of ideological considerations or deep concern for Algeria's Jews. Giraud stepped into a movement where other prominent Frenchmen from the mainland were also in key roles, many of whom were equally or more conservative. This was particularly true of the so-called Committee of Five, the group of French businessmen and officers who worked closely with the insurgents and the Americans and coordinated many of their efforts. The group included Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, a committed monarchist and longtime member of the Action Française, Charles Maurras's immensely influential neo-monarchist, anti-democratic, ultranationalist political party, for which a virulent anti-Semitism was a central preoccupation since its founding during the Dreyfus Affair. D'Astier was rumored to have participated in the Cagoule of 1936 to 1937. The Cagoule was originally a breakaway from Action Française. It was an extreme right underground revolutionary movement whose long list of avowed enemies and targets included Jews. Working closely with Italian fascists, the Cagoulards stockpiled weapons, assassinated leftists, and planned a coup d'etat against the Front Populaire. Two other members of the Committee of Five, Jean Rigaud and Jacques Lemaître-Dubreuil, were confirmed former Cagoulards. Rigaud used his closeness to the Vichy regime to foster contacts between certain officials and the movement in Algiers. Lemaître-Dubreuil admired Vichy's anti-democratic, autocratic tendencies and its arch-conservative National Revolution program of national renewal, and he was deeply suspicious of communism. Both were avowedly anti-Gaullist. A fourth member of the committee, Colonel A.S. Van Eck, actually headed the Chantier de la Jeunesse, Vichy's official scouting organization meant in large part to serve as a youth movement that would acquire and help to spread the values of the National Revolution. Van Eck sought to rally several hundred chantiers as troops within the Algiers underground. As the work of Daniel Lee has shown recently, the chantier in the mainland did for a time offer protection to a significant number of Jews. Nonetheless, in November 1941, in a ministerial memo, Van Eck made no bones about the fact that he thought the chantier in North Africa should not accept any Jewish members at all because Jews, he claimed, could not acquire the nationalistic values of the National Revolution. In his memoir of the early years of the resistance, Jacques Soustelle would claim about Rigaud and Lemaître-Dubreuil, and this might be said about a number of the Vichyistes résistants, quote, their hostility toward Germany was matched by their hostility toward Free France. A, quote, free Vichy was not a free France, but rather the National Revolution freed from the Hitlerian shackles and protected by Washington. This is what they wanted, and this is what they almost got. Soustelle's caustic remark hinted at a deeper truth that we can better appreciate in light of the current scholarship on the Vichyistes résistants. A key contingent of the insurgency comprised men who, even as they took great risks and joined clandestine networks to resume the fight against the Germans, also had links to Vichy that continued to influence their resistance work. Now, this successful turn of the Vichyistes résistants would not have been possible absent their unlikely alliance with a scrappy group of Algerian Jews. These Jews emerged from what I have described elsewhere, borrowing the terminology of David Sorkin, as an Algerian Jewish subculture in the wider European sector of Algerian colonial society. That is, even as these Jews took French first names in public, spoke primarily French in public, often saw themselves as unqualifiedly French, their primary community was made up of other Algerian Jewish individuals, groups, and institutions. This was reflected in a number of common characteristics of the Jews in the insurgency. Taking us into the third nodal point in our story, these Jews tended to cluster in certain neighborhoods of Algiers with high concentrations of Jews. We see marked on this map a few of those places in Algiers, as well as scenes from those neighborhoods on the left. Moreover, in many cases, large numbers of resistors hailed from the same extended family. Among the Aboulker family, for example, some 15 siblings, cousins, and uncles across 2 cities took part in the insurgency. Beyond social geography and kinship networks, a high percentage of these Jews came from families that were active in major Jewish organizations, particularly those that sought to fight anti-Semitism and improve relations with the Muslim and Christian populations. These included the major community political organization, the Algerian Jewish Committee of Social Studies, or the CJAES, and the Algerian branch of the largest French anti-racist organization, the International League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, better known as the LICA. The organizational mission of both the CJAES and the LICA made them logical entry points from which to move into active resistance during the war. The CJAES defined its goal as, quote, keeping vigil in order that Jews' free exercise of the rights of the citizen neither be violated nor little known. The LICA was an organization founded precisely to combat anti-Semitism and whose functions by the mid-1930s included that of having certain members act as a Jewish defense force. Shortly after Vichy dissolved the LICA in 1940, José Aboulker's cousin Raphael, pictured here on the left, who had begun attending the LICA meetings a few months earlier in Algiers, gathered dispersed members of the organization and directed them toward the newly formed so-called Géograsse group. Among the founders of the Géograsse group were Émile Atlan and André Temim, both former activists in the recently banned LICA. In my research, I've identified as many as 36 former LICA activists who participated in the insurrection. Other examples of the active Jewishness of participants included charity, the local Jewish aid organizations or schools in the years before the war, and the several Jews in the underground who also had a role in creating a newly self-reliant Jewish school system in the face of Vichy's anti-Semitic laws. Being active in organizations like the LICA reflected another common element of the Jews in the insurgency, the newly aggressive politics that defined the actions and outlook of many of them. One of the characteristics of a new generation coming of age in the 1930s, which highlights again the paradoxical nature of the wartime rebel alliance, was widespread activism in anti-fascist politics. So this is extremely common for many of those who took leading roles in the insurgency. Particularly in the era after the 1934 Constantine riots, a new generation of Algerian Jews joined groups like the LICA and became active in large numbers in the Algerian Communist Party. And this marked the beginnings of a key shift. Unlike much of the community establishment of their parents' generation, these Jews took a more confrontational pose, gathering arms, standing up to fascists in the street, and even preemptively attacking on occasion. And the clearest echo of this newly aggressive posture within the resistance appeared in the Géograsse self-defense group that formed in autumn 1940, and that would supply in time 130 of the insurgents who fought on November 8th. You see pictured here the boxer Géograsse, for whom the group was named. He agreed to open this space only thinking that it was a space for physical fitness and training, whereas secretly this militia was preparing itself there. It became a training ground for Jewish shock troops who would both prepare to fight against Hitler and to defend Jews. And its ranks included 80 so-called toughs, described by resistor Lucien Adès as muscular, daring fighters. They were ready at a moment's notice to confront the local militias that regularly attacked Jews. New aspirants to the Géograsse group were closely screened. If accepted, they then took an oath to fight to the death for the liberation of France and the defeat of the Germans, and specifically to defend Algerian Jews. And there was a sense of this generational shift that was present for Henri Aboulker, father of José, who had agreed to let his home be the headquarters for the resistance in the weeks before the landing, when he recounted later this story, and he spoke about the activism of José and his sister Colette. Ultimately, he explained he had agreed to let them use his home as a hub, mostly because he feared for their safety and sought to protect them as any father would, but he also admired them. Put the quote here. He said, "They received no outside material help, absolutely none, and they all made great personal sacrifices. At various times, I tried to reimburse them. They refused. I insisted. They became angry. Having seen all that up close, I loved them all the more. I was disgusted at the general passivity, the universal spinelessness I had seen for years, above all since the defeat. If I had died in 1940 or 1941, I would have died in despair. Having seen the work of the boys of November 8th, I was relieved I could die in peace. They furnished explosive proof that pessimism should be set aside, that there reside in our youth resources that are unexpected, immense, unlimited." This generation's newly assertive left-wing politics hardly aligned, I think that's an understatement, with those of the Vichyist résistants that were, of course, connected very much to the right, yet with whom they conspired in the insurgency. And indeed, José Aboulker and Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie understood that their alliance based on disparate goals could only be possible if the movement reached a formal agreement to avoid politics altogether while pursuing its common ends. The two men did just that in summer of 1942, with the understanding that each group would immediately regain its freedom of political action following a successful Allied landing. Once again, this extreme mixture of strange bedfellows and pragmatism defies enduring assumptions about the ideological stakes of both Jewish and non-Jewish resistance. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because that's the end of my PowerPoint images. So what was it that made such an alliance, however fleeting, possible? Contemporary political alignments and historical precedents weighed heavily against it. At the heart of the alliance was a relationship between two men who seemed to have little in common. The young Jewish anti-fascist from Algiers, José Aboulker, and the middle-aged French monarchist Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie. 55 years later, in an interview, Aboulker would put it this way, quote, "We knew that he was a monarchist and even probably a Camelot du Roi." And he referred here to the so-called King's Camelots, the youth organization of the Action Française that frequently engaged in protests and violent street altercations in the 1930s. Aboulker continued, "Why did I reach an understanding with him? Me, a Jew, 22 years old, an anti-fascist. This man had probably cried, 'Death to the Jews,' during protests in the Latin Quarter in Paris." This comment alluded to the way that numerous Jews on one side and arch conservatives on the other had been active in opposing camps in the pitched ideological struggles of the 1930s. But it also harkened back to a longer history wherein Jews and monarchists had hardly mixed well in modern French history. As Maurice Samuel's new book, The Betrayal of the Duchess, shows, in fact, tensions between monarchists and Jews were crucial to the origins of modern French anti-Semitism. During the 1832 uprising of the so-called Bourbon Legitimists that sought to reclaim the throne from the more modern Orleanist branch, Simon Dutz, son of the chief rabbi of France and a recent convert to Catholicism, played a key role. First, Dutz gained the confidence of the uprising's leader, the Duchess de Berry, and then in exchange for a large reward from the French government, he betrayed her. Dutz rapidly became dubbed, quote, "a second Judas," and was seen as the very embodiment of all the evils of modernism that the Legitimists and their supporters so desperately opposed. More recently, in the late 19th century, Arthur Mayer, a wealthy Jewish capitalist, had directed the right-wing royalist newspaper Le Gallois, eventually becoming an ardent anti-Dreyfusard, converting to Catholicism, and marrying a woman of noble origin at the age of 60. Mayer was heavily criticized by Jewish activists like Bernard Lazare for betraying his origins and exploiting the working class. So there was a great deal of baggage, if you will, weighing down the possibility of close cooperation between an ardent monarchist and a visible Jew. And yet a series of considerations, both practical and ideological, brought together Aboulker and d'Astier, and by extension, many around them. On the pragmatic side, we have seen that the US State Department decided to set aside concerns about policy and rights in the short term in order to prioritize military victory. This meant supporting what became a coalition of conservative, even anti-Semitic forces and Jewish activists, since both groups were ready to help pave the way for the Anglo-American landing. Algerian Jews, meanwhile, had already in the interwar years, particularly after the murderous Constantine riots of August 1934, ceased to rely, as they long had, on the French government to protect their position. In an exception to Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's well-known argument about modern Jewish politics, they had moved increasingly from, to use his terms, vertical to horizontal alliances. In the 1930s, these were largely with reformists and Muslims on the left. But after the shattering events of 1940, the same Jews were equally prepared to team with forces on the right in a temporary alliance against a common foe. Likewise, in his memoir of the insurgency, José Aboulker himself points out that military and business leaders looking for a band of rebels had limited options in Algiers in the 1940s. Here, unlike in France, where Jews were a tiny percentage of the population, Jews made up 10% of the French citizens. Moreover, insists Aboulker, for those looking for allies to fight the Germans, Jews' particular motivations made them the surest bet. As historian Joanna Barrage has argued, political flexibility was more broadly a hallmark of the Vichyist résistants. By 1943, notes Barrage, despite their fierce anti-communism, for instance, they had decided to work alongside communists in order to be accepted within the broader French resistance. The insurrection of Algiers shows that their pragmatism, in fact, dated from earlier and extended even to an alliance with Jews. Ideological considerations, though, were also important. Aboulker's supposition about d'Astier's participation in anti-Semitic rallies notwithstanding, d'Astier's brand of monarchism took a more moderate position on Jews. He came from a family that had supported the monarchy for generations. And while he retained sympathy for the more radical neo-monarchism of Charles Maurras into the late 1930s, he was more closely allied with Henri d'Orléans, the Comte de Paris, and the primary pretender at this time to the royal throne. In fact, in the days after the American landing, Dastier even helped to bring Henri to Algiers, where he holed him up in his apartment as he sought to negotiate a monarchic restoration. American General Dwight Eisenhower quickly quashed this idea. The Comte de Paris had repeatedly condemned the Action Française in the 1930s and sought to create an alternative strand of royalism. In January 1939, he had even penned an article in his movement's newspaper, the Courrier Royal, where he denounced anti-Semitism in no uncertain terms. He wrote, quote, "It is certainly abusive to speak of a Jewish peril in France. In particular," he highlighted the way that Jews whose families had long resided in France should be assumed to be good citizens. "These Jews," he wrote, quote, "took part as soldiers, as officers in the national wars. They have mixed their blood with that of the peasants, the workers, the bourgeois of France. They are French, and to want to exclude them from the national community, or even to deny their full rights as French citizens, is to wish to weaken the country that they have served and that they should continue to serve." This column was reprinted in the Bulletin of the Federation of Jewish Societies of Algeria, the community's monthly newsletter. And given the level of involvement of the Abdelkader with community institutions, it is extremely likely that many members of the family and those in the wider milieu of the insurgency would have read this article and thus been familiar with the more progressive turn in royalist thinking regarding the Jews. The mention of Jewish soldiers specifically here was also hardly incidental. Even in an infamous statement where he embraced Marshal Pétain and Vichy, leading conservative resistor Henri Frenay had answered the question of who to recruit to the resistance by saying, quote, "Frenchmen of old extraction to the exclusion of foreigners, even those who are naturalized, and Jews if they really fought in one of the two world wars." A very high percentage of the Jewish fighters in the Algiers insurrection were veterans of the campaign of 1940, including José Abdelkader himself, who had served as an army medic. Abdelkader would later explain his close cooperation with Dastier in simpler terms, quote, "We had something in common that the generations of today no longer are familiar with, and which is called patriotism, which was a sentiment of a force that no one could doubt." But part of what appeared to underlay this mutual sense of patriotism was specifically the devotion displayed on the battlefield by Abdelkader, his father before him in World War I, and so many of their Algerian Jewish comrades. So to conclude, the unlikely alliance at the heart of the November 8th insurrection between Jews and frequently anti-Semitic arch-conservatives forces us to rethink our conventional picture of who resisted and why during the Second World War and the Shoah. Admittedly, part of our misperception can be laid at the feet of the post-war writings of the leading insurgents themselves. In 1946, when Dastier submitted a list of those who had participated in the insurrection, he depicted himself as their undisputed leader, and while he did include José Abdelkader, he explicitly excluded hundreds of others, mostly Jewish, who were now part of a Veterans Association of November 8th, which he claimed was not to be confused with the resistance network itself. Likewise, Abdelkader's own memoir, while paying tribute to Dastier, spoke about the broader Committee of Five in acid terms, calling them a total failure in contrast to the shock troops he had led, and describing the characteristics of the sincere Vichyist résistants as, quote, "honorable and ineffective," while mocking the group more generally as, by definition, indecisive. And yet, nonetheless, it was this rebel alliance that made the Algiers underground at once arguably the finest hour of the Vichyist résistants, and strategically speaking, the most consequential Jewish resistance movement of the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan, for that. Was really fascinating. A story that I did not know much about, and I'm completely fascinated by it. And I personally have a lot of questions. I would encourage everyone in the audience to please submit questions using the Q&A function. We have a bunch, mostly from Alice Kaplan, who is very eager, I know, to, I will ventriloquize her questions. But first of all, a question, just a little background, I think might be helpful for people listening. So at one point you did mention that Jews were 10% of the population of Algiers, and I think that might surprise people. So if you could say a little bit more about the demographics in Algeria, and especially in the cities, and also bringing in Muslims and the relative population?
Yeah. So, I mean, Algeria broadly had 6 million some Muslims at this time, roughly a million French settlers, and 120,000 or so Jews. So they are 10% of the French citizens, broadly speaking, in Algeria. It so happens that Algiers is substantially a European city in many ways by the 1930s. That is, almost 70% of the inhabitants are either settlers or Jews. I think it's about 9% Jewish, 60% settler, 30% Muslim. Yeah, I mean, the demographics are such that Jews are, I mean, a whole other piece of the story is that Jews are seeking to regain, of course, a position of equal citizenship, and they are fighting off the prospect of Nazism, but they are also, you know, essentially fighting to recover what remains a privileged position in colonial society. There are extensive debates about what Jews should do with regard to that very question in the period after the landing, particularly because it takes so long for citizenship to be restored. And there is pressure from certain Muslim allies for them to pursue equal citizenship for all rather than simply for themselves. Happy to speak more about those.
Okay. All right. So here's one of Alice's questions. So all these Vichy guys, had they ever been in Algeria before 1942? Were they thinking about Algeria and France? And the anti-Semites on the far right, on the ground in Algeria, were they much more extreme than the Vichy guys? Were they like, you know, Céline level anti-Semites?
Great questions. So, I mean, most of these guys had not been in Algeria before. I mean, certainly not the people in the Committee of Five. They go there. I mean, in many cases, they go there already in 1940. And like, you can read conflicting accounts of some of their motivations. Like, Le Maître du Bois is this super successful businessman, and some people think that he was very cynical in his, you know, connections to the Americans and the Committee of Five. Other people have more charitable interpretations of him as a patriot. But there's a series of business interests that lead certain people there. In some cases, people go there because they are compromised. Dastier was in a resistance network in France proper, and they escape to Algeria. But basically, I mean, I shouldn't say that they've never been, I can't say whether they ever visited Algeria previously, right? But they have no particular history or connection to Algeria. So yes, I mean, by and large, I would say that these folks are, anti-Semitism is less central for them than it is for, you know, sort of the ultras of the settler classes, which Alice, you know at least as much about as I do. And, you know, anti-Semitism was really central to their political culture. You know, clearly there's a calculus that goes on. I try to explain some of that calculus in my talk, where it's not that most of these folks who are the Vichyist resistants are necessarily that positively disposed toward Jews, but they are more focused on, you know, reigniting the war against the Germans. And we have to keep in mind, I mean, once we have that agreement in the summer of 1942 between Dastier and Aboulker, it's explicit that this is for a finite period of time. I mean, they can, it's always easier to work with someone who you ardently disagree with when you know you're going to have a chance to hash out those disagreements later. So I think that's crucial as well. I think I answered.
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to probe a little bit more about the Vichy resistance guys. And so, you know, listening to it, I couldn't help thinking, not to, you know, presentize, but I couldn't help thinking about like the Lincoln Project, you know, and different, I mean, so what, first of all, like, you know, what is really, I mean, is it about patriotism? Is it just about like this idea that like, how can you side with, you know, the invader, the enemy? And if so, like, what does take them so long? You know, like, you know, like, when do they start to resist? I mean, you know, Mitterrand, it's not until 1943. So is that, how much of that is waiting to see which way the wind was, you know, which way the war would go?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, they're not one group, right? Those that have been put under this rubric by historians in recent years. So there are those who actually are very early to the game. in a way that is shocking to us today because of the way that we've aligned the extreme right of the 30s with ardent Vichyism in the 40s. But some of those folks in the early months are already saying, well, the marshal can't resist. We got to do it for him. And so some of them are not at all latecomers. Then you have people like Mitterrand who evolve in some way, whether you want to say that evolution is purely kind of cynical and self-serving, or whether you want to say that they, realize. I mean, there are certainly folks also who are loyalists to Vichy without being active resistors, partly because they assume the marshal is acting on their behalf, and they come to conclude over time that he is not, and they then become disillusioned with the regime and become resistors. But I think patriotism is the heart of it. I mean, I think that there are people who just feel very strongly against the Germans. They feel ultimately like they have to defend France, and that's sort of their kind of singular focus in the early months there. And in a way, it maybe isn't that surprising on reflection that some of the same extreme right guys from the 30s are some of the earliest to want to resist within the Vichy circles, because they're used to being active in kind of radical politics, and their radical politics has its own kind of ardent patriotic nationalism attached to it already before the war.
Great. Okay. So questions I'm seeing here about Muslims and about, so if you could say a little bit more about Muslim resistance here, and also a question from someone in the audience who wants you to clarify the use of the term Muslim. So are you referring to a mostly Arabized elite or the Amazigh communities, or both? And and if you could say more about their role in this resistance.
Yeah, so I mean, the role of Muslims, and I would use that term to describe, just as I would in a parallel way to the way that I would use the term Jews, and I talk a little bit about this in my first book. I mean, I think there were and are many ways to be in some way connected to Muslimness. For some people, that is Islam as a religion, and for other people, it's much more cultural. And that certainly was true in Algeria. The category of Muslim was racialized by the French administration, such that it did not distinguish between religious practice or lack of practice at all, and it was all based on descent. But the reality was a very large spectrum. So to me, I mean, there were various Muslim political groups, and we can talk a little bit more about that. There were very few Muslims in this resistance movement. If we want to talk about Muslim resistors during the war, the two most common avenues are aligning with the Algerian Communist Party and then joining the liberation armies as they begin to fight their way up into France, right? That's the vast majority of Muslim Algerians who join the resistance in some form. But there are interesting exceptions. And the most interesting, I have a whole chapter about him in the book, is a man named Mohammed Abdelaziz Kassus, who is very closely aligned with a certain movement in Algeria led by Ferhat Abbas, which is sort of a reformist movement that is increasingly moving toward nationalism. And Kassus is actually the primary author of a famous document from during the war, the Manifeste of the Algerian People, which comes out in 1943, in March of 1943. And in that manifest, it actually says, given the repeal of the Crémieux Decree, Algerian Muslims are led to wonder if French citizenship is worth much less than it would be to be an Algerian citizen. So there are certain Muslims like that who actually talk very actively about sort of the connection between what goes on with Jews during the war and how they are looking for new political alignments, including an alliance, as I referred to, between Muslims and Jews to fight for equal rights. And there are a handful of other Muslims who are referred to in various accounts of the uprising who participated in different groups for sure. But there were also those in the movement who were worried about the intensity of Axis propaganda vis-a-vis Muslims, and therefore were hesitant to invite Muslims to join. I think broadly speaking, this was ultimately a fight to throw off the Germans and for many Jews to regain their citizenship. It wasn't a fight that necessarily clearly implicated Muslim political activists for some of the reasons I've already said.
Okay, great. So here's a question from David Sorkin. He says that Vichy's Jewish statutes of 1941 included exemptions for Jews who had fought in either World War or whose families had been in France for 5 generations. So in what sense could you say that the monarchist reactionary figures in the uprising are actually acting in line with a certain understanding of Vichy policy?
Yeah, great question as usual. Thank you, David. So yeah, I mean, I actually thought of mentioning that. Clearly, there's a broader way in which military service is honored by Vichy, including to a significant extent for Jews. You have all these petitions to Vichy that many of us, have seen from right after the first anti-Jewish statute, where people say, my husband or my father served in World War I, and you should make an exception for him. Now, while most of those are not honored, it's a reflection partly already of sort of the cultural ethos around wartime service. And then, as David said, there are these exemptions in 1941. So yeah, I mean, I think that it does reflect that. I think, one of the other things I talk about in the book is that a kind of effort to regain manhood is one of the things that goes on in this Jewish insurgency. And you have, you saw briefly the images there, you have a boxing rink as the center for the largest force within the insurgency. You have like famous boxers coming through there. You have fencing, which, however strange it may seem to us today, was very strongly associated with European manhood at this time, and Jews had been disproportionately participating in fencing for decades. You had a lot of fencing competitions. You had Jewish finalists who were in the fencing competitions in Algeria in the early 40s, despite the opposition of Antisemites. So you had all this sort of hyper-masculine energy, and many of these people were veterans, as I said, of the campaign in 1940. So in some ways, I think all of this is kind of connected, that their effort to reclaim masculinity comes partly in the form of joining a resistance group, and they are more palatable to certain rightists because of the fact that they connect to military background, military culture.
So to follow up on that question, there's all this, you're describing this sort of masculine energy. It's this story about reclaiming masculine identity. But what about women in these resistance groups? You mentioned Colette, the sister of José, I think. But were there other women involved?
There were other women, and Colette herself is fascinating. And actually, I'm starting the book with Colette because she wrote a 5-volume memoir of her childhood. She later became a very kind of illustrious sort of healer through psychological work in Israel. And so she is a deeply spiritual person, and that's part of what punctuates her memoir. But she also shows how much she felt the burden of her family's history. I didn't have time to get into it here, but her family had this kind of rabbinic dynasty in its history. It had then all these people who'd been like the first Jew to practice medicine in Algiers, people who were enormously successful in secular colonial society. And so she hears things from family, and she says things like, I understood that I would be the one in my generation to help save the Jewish people, maybe to save the world. So she's fascinating, and she plays a really important role. I mean, her father also describes how she kept everything together in the house when everything's buzzing and there's a million people coming through, and she's basically, keeping all the trains running. There are several other women who maybe we would say have comparable roles. The wife of Émile Atlan, Florence Atlan, there's accounts about how she's making food for all of these people on the night of the uprising, and she's hiding guns in different places in the house. It's clearly a small number of women who participate, and we even have an account of one sort of altercation a little bit on the night of the uprising where certain male resistors don't want women taking part, which I think reinforces the sense of a kind of hyper-masculine identity for certain segments. But there were women who played important roles, certainly, particularly Colette Abouka.
Great. Okay, another question from Alice Kaplan. She's wondering what you have to say about the reluctance of the Allies to cancel the abrogation of the Crémieux decree. So the Jews had to wait for months to get their citizenship back. How do we explain that? Is that American anti-Semitism at work, or is it the fault of the French? What?
Well, I mean, it's a complex story. I think the Americans were persuaded, and Robert Murphy writes about this in his memoir in ways that are frankly embarrassing at this point, but he felt very strongly that the Americans were very worried that there would be a lot of Muslim anger if Jewish citizenship was restored. There is intense lobbying from the American Jewish community that takes place, and that ultimately has a significant impact. And people are miffed, and Murphy says they didn't understand how everything was so different in North Africa. North African Jews are different. North African society is different. But there definitely were people who were persuaded that Jewish-Muslim enmity was, primordial, and that if Jews were given back their citizenship, despite the fact that then Jews produced letters, right, from like leading Muslim city councilors and figures saying, we don't have any joy about the abrogation of the Crémieux decree, and that's not something we celebrated, at all. So that's clearly a factor. Then I think have folks who never, you have a significant segment of Algerian colonial society that had been campaigning for the abrogation of the Crémieux decree for 70 years. And so was deeply invested in that. And, to some extent, people like Henri Giraud, who's the governor general for a while after the landing, they are kind of responding to the pressure from those folks. And some of those folks and some of the other Vichy officials are also saying there'll be a civil war between the Jews and the Muslims. So there's a lot of that. But I also think that the story I told today is an important ingredient. That is, the Vichyistes résistants are basically like the slates wiped clean in November 1942. They and many of their supporters want to kind of rechart what colonial Algeria looks like. Jews are fighting for a different vision of colonial Algeria that aligns with their Republican Judaism. And so it's not shocking in that way that, given that they had no ideological consensus and that these two visions were so opposed, it's not shocking that it took effectively months to hash that out. And it's inseparable from the struggle between the Giroudist forces and the Gaullist forces in Algeria in 1943.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, I'm going to ask a selfish question here, and I wanted to, thank you for mentioning my book. And I was very interested. I'm very interested in how anti-Semitism becomes a key part of right-wing ideology in France. And so, part of what I was interested in was looking at, a possible origin point for that, or, one of the possible origin points. But, we know that something, we normally think of World War II as sort of the culmination of that, right? Of Vichy is the culmination, it's the revenge for Dreyfus, and they're able to enact, to really make anti-Semitism a part of state policy. But you're kind of giving this possible other way to see it, and that maybe it's the culmination, but it's also things go over the hill, and it's maybe also the end, or an end point for that. I don't know. How do you see that? Because it's true that anti-Semitism stops being a kind of key, the key part of right-wing ideology after World War II, partly because it's discredited by Hitler, but maybe there's also something else going on too.
Well, so I'm still learning a lot about monarchists in 20th century France, an understudied subject for sure. But what I've gathered is, you have the Action Française, which is this neo-monarchist organization. But of course, they attract many folks who are not monarchists per se, not the Dastier style of monarchists where like your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather were monarchists for generations, but people who are basically interested in right-wing radical politics. And Jean Maurras is arguably the most influential right-wing radical thinker in 20th century France. So that's like a different brand of monarchism, but it becomes discredited effectively by a lot of the traditional monarchists by the 20s and 30s, right? They're renounced by the Holy See, I think in 1927, and then they're renounced by Henri in the mid-30s. And we should point out, it's a complicated history, but because the Bourbons, the Legitimists, who are traditionally the more conservative ones, were stuck, as it were, with a Spanish line from the 1880s, Henri becomes the de facto pretender kind of for everybody, even though he's from the Orleanist branch. But perhaps a consequence of that is that the Orleanists, always more moderate, end up, he ends up sort of pushing things in a more moderate direction. Yeah, I mean, I think we could say that as anti-Semitism becomes radicalized in the 30s and early 40s, it becomes much more uncomfortable for certain monarchists who are more traditionalist.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's super interesting. Okay, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask one other question about why more Algerian Jews who were expelled from their schools in 1940, faced all these anti-Semitic persecutions. Why didn't more side with the FLN in the 50s? What do you think? How do you explain that?
Great question, right? It's sort of a $64,000 question about Algerian history. Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways there's a parallel between, if you will, 1900 in the French mainland, where the Dreyfus affair is almost forgotten and seen as, okay, the Republic works. Eventually, Dreyfus was pardoned, and then, of course, he was exonerated in 1906. There's a parallel in some ways between that and 1945 in Algeria. I mean, to some extent in the French mainland as well. But, basically, the Vichy years are, in a way, I mean, they're not entirely forgotten. And so you have the attempt of the FLN during the 50s repeatedly to invoke the Vichy years and say, the same people who are advocating for colonialism are the ones who, took away your citizenship and treated you horribly then. And we were we were in solidarity with you. But in a certain way, it's like the Jews basically just, kind of want to paper that over and think that like the real France was the France that restored their rights. And they just, they also see themselves, they see themselves as so Frenchified by the 50s that in a way it's almost like there's no going back.
So they buy into the Gaullist myth in a sense, and then
You're saying of the resistors?
No. The post-war Gaullist myth, yes, of that everyone had resisted, that wasn't the real France that had done this to them, and
yeah, but I think also they just they see themselves as products of a process of successful emancipation and Frenchification, and they see Muslims as like on the same track, they hope, just several steps behind, and they kind of carry that vision through to the end.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank you for this really enlightening and just fascinating presentation, and thanks for sharing it and co-hosting this event with us. So we're really looking forward to the book. So I know everyone else is applauding at home, but I'm applauding you.
For me, thanks for all the questions.
Yeah.